Mindfulness training has become a very popular technique to improve mental well-being. It's very much utilised by psychologists in the effort to reduce stress and to manage several different mental health conditions. Now, one of the leading benefits of boxing and kickboxing training is that the activities within this exercise require a lot of mindfulness. So when you're engaging in learning different punching techniques and kicking techniques, one thing's for sure, you have to be present. You have to be mindful of what you're doing. And when we combine that with the health benefits or the cardiorespiratory benefits of exercise, we get a nice 1-2 punch for mental health. We can see clearly that this type of exercise, due to its high cognitive demand and the need to be present and focused on the activity at the time, can lead to benefits such as stress reduction. It can improve mental clarity, it can help with decision making and executive functions, and it can help with dual tasking. Critically, what we know is that by engaging in any form of exercise that requires the use of skill, coordination, balance, we have to really be focused on the present time. And that is the whole basis for mindfulness training. In meditation or mindfulness practice, we are deliberately trying to quiet our mind and eliminate thoughts of past and present and focus on breathing or focus on something that allows us to think in a way that's non-judgmental, particularly towards ourselves. Now, if we draw a parallel to something like kickboxing and boxing, where we're actually in the middle of learning a new combination, the first thing that happens is initially there's a lot of internal dialogue. So that in itself may be beneficial for mindfulness, it may not be. But what then happens is, to get past the cognitive stage of learning and get to the next stage of learning, which is the associative stage of learning, we have to let go a bit of that internal dialogue. But with practice and repetition, you transfer past that stage and you move into an associative stage of learning where that actual technique or that set of combinations is becoming that little bit easier to perform. And once again, with further practice, you actually then move on to what's known as the autonomous stage, where in actual fact, you're performing the movement without the level of internal dialogue and heavy cognitive load that comes with trying to learn a new skill. And it's at this stage where we're probably at a point which would be close to what's known as physical meditation. That is, we're performing an activity, we're engaged in that activity, but we're not judgmental of ourselves, we're not criticising ourselves, we're not critiquing ourselves through that learning process. And when we arrive at this point, I think we can confidently say that it's this specific and unique nature of boxing and kickboxing training that brings in the element of mindfulness training. We think about an activity like running or cycling. The activity is very quickly mastered, and once you've mastered that activity, the attentional focus on internal and external cues becomes lower and lower, and that probably leaves the mind more open to thinking about other things and being aware of what's happening in your life at the time. If we contrast that to something like boxing and kickboxing, where you come into a session and immediately from the very beginning of that session there's a strong focus on external cues. That is, where am I punching? I'm punching a target. I've got to look at that target. I've got to be aware of how my hand or foot is positioned when I strike that target. This is a really good example of an external cue, and I think when we're undertaking an activity that has a high emphasis on external cues, we're less likely to have room cognitively to be aware of what's happening in our life at the time, and that creates that mindfulness that if I'm not completely engaged and present in what I'm doing, and that might be punching or kicking an object, I'm going to make a mistake, or my coach is going to pick me up on that. So in that instance, we can see that ability to what many call zone out, or at least become completely aware of what you're doing at the time and less aware of what's happening around you, like your stresses, for example, gets heightened. And I think the key is that this is the unique aspect of boxing and kickboxing, that it's the external cueing that takes place for the whole session, that requirement and need to be focused on where you're positioning your hands and your feet, where your balance is, where your positioning is, on a constant basis in this type of training that leads to that beneficial effect on mindfulness. I think we can draw some parallels on the mindfulness with the results of a recent study that's been published coming out of the Australian Institute of Sport, where they looked at the effect on punching performance in a group of combat athletes who were given either internal cues and external cues. And what the study showed is when athletes were given an external cue, they actually were able to punch harder and more effectively. And I think when we talk about mindfulness, this translates to the internal cues weren't so successful, possibly because, at least with those athletes, they would have been thinking too much about what's happening within their body. And when we think about mindfulness, one of the things we're trying to do is lessen internal dialogue. We're trying to reduce the internal focus on our stresses of the day, our worries of the day, and we're trying to increase the focus on the task at hand. And that's really like an external cue. So when your coach says to you, I want you to hit the pad as fast as you can, that's an external cue. And to do that, you have to be very present. You have to be mindful of what you're doing. And whilst ever we're engaging in something that's mindful, we have less internal dialogue, and I think we can say confidently that we're likely to see improvements in our ability to be mindful and practice physical mindfulness.